Every time you turn on the news or see a political ad, you're likely being manipulated by fear. It sounds crazy, but it's true. Politicians have been using fear for decades to get votes, and it works. In fact, research shows that people are 60% more likely to vote based on fear rather than logic. And when fear is involved, it's easier to make quick decisions that don't always reflect what's best for us. What's even crazier? Studies reveal that fear can make us more loyal to the candidate we choose, even if we don't agree with everything they say. That's why politicians love to play on our emotions, because fear clouds judgment. The more scared we feel, the more likely we are to give them our support. In this video, we're diving deep into how politicians use fear to control our decisions. From manipulating national tragedies to using psychological tricks, we'll uncover the secret strategies they don't want you to know. By the end, you'll understand how to spot fear-based tactics and, more importantly, how to stop them from influencing you. So stay with us, because you might never look at politics the same way again. Chapter 1: Fear as a Political Weapon. The unseen hand. Fear has long been used as a political weapon, yet it's not always recognized for its power. Politicians know that fear is a powerful motivator that can drive voters to act impulsively. When a candidate amplifies a threat, it often leads to stronger voter support, especially when the threat feels imminent. This strategy is known as scare politics, where fear clouds judgment and pushes people to vote for the candidate who promises safety. Take, for example, the post-9/11 political environment. George W. Bush's approval ratings soared as he promised to protect the U.S. from terrorism, creating a national sense of fear. According to a study by the American Political Science Review, fear often shifts public opinion, making voters more likely to support candidates who promise security. This strategy isn't new. Governments and leaders throughout history have used fear to control the masses. But how do politicians create fear? It's simple: exaggerate threats and repeat them. When people hear a message often enough, they begin to believe it, even if it's based on misinformation. Politicians use a technique known as fear-mongering, where they exaggerate threats to create panic. It's a psychological tactic that plays on our primal instincts of fight or flight. In times of crisis, politicians often present themselves as the only solution to protect the public. A classic example is the use of fear in wartime politics. Franklin D. Roosevelt used the fear of the Axis powers during World War II to unite the country under a single cause. Roosevelt's famous Day of Infamy speech in 1941 is an example of how a leader can manipulate fear to rally people behind a common enemy. Fear doesn't just appeal to the gut, it also plays into our desire for certainty. Politicians exploit this by framing themselves as the protector of the status quo. In uncertain times, we're drawn to those who promise stability, even if their solutions are extreme. Fear-based politics thrive in a climate where people feel vulnerable, whether from terrorism, economic collapse, or a divided society. Chapter 2: The Manipulative Science. Fear in the brain. To understand how fear works as a political tool, we need to look inside the brain. When we experience fear, our amygdala, the part of the brain that processes emotions, is activated. This is our fight or flight response kicking in, making us more reactive than rational. According to neuroscientists, fear can override our logical thinking, leading to decisions based on emotion rather than reason. Fear is effective because it's hardwired into human nature. The American Psychological Association has shown that fear can increase people's willingness to support policies they would otherwise reject. This is particularly true when the threat feels immediate. For example, a study from the University of California found that when people are told of a potential threat, their risk tolerance increases, but their decision-making becomes more focused on short-term safety rather than long-term consequences. Politicians know that our brains are more sensitive to negative information than positive information. This is called the negativity bias. It's why we tend to remember bad news longer than good news. Studies show that negative political ads, which often invoke fear, are more memorable and persuasive than positive ads. In one experiment, participants remembered negative ads about candidates 25% longer than positive ones. When a political ad uses fear to influence voters, it taps into this bias, often bypassing the logical parts of our brain. Instead of engaging in thoughtful analysis, voters react instinctively. This is why fear-based campaigns are often so successful. They trigger deep emotional responses that cloud judgment. Furthermore, the use of fear in campaigns can also create division. The fear of an other, whether it's a foreign enemy or an internal threat, can unite a group against a common adversary. This tactic was used during the Cold War when politicians stoked fear of communism to solidify their political base. Today, we see similar strategies with fears of immigration or crime, where politicians cast certain groups as threats to national security. Chapter 3. Hype Dangers. Creating a crisis that doesn't exist. One of the most effective ways politicians use fear is by creating a crisis that doesn't really exist, but feels real. This is often seen in the way politicians exaggerate certain dangers to build a narrative of urgency. For example, the fear of rising crime rates, even when crime has been decreasing, can be used to justify stricter laws or more government control. Take the 1980s war on drugs, for instance. Politicians, including President Ronald Reagan, used the fear of drug addiction to push for policies that expanded the prison system. Despite the fact that drug use was actually on the decline, the media and politicians painted a picture of a nation overwhelmed by drug lords. By focusing on fear, they were able to pass laws that severely impacted minority communities, all under the guise of safety. In recent years, politicians have also used fear of terrorism to push their agendas. After the 9/11 attacks, policies like the Patriot Act were passed with the promise of national security, despite concerns about civil liberties. According to the Brennan Center for Justice, such laws often sacrifice personal freedoms in the name of safety, justified by the constant reminder of the threat of terrorism. Another way fear is used is through exaggerating threats from political opponents. When politicians claim their rivals are dangerous, radical, or un-American, it creates a sense of fear and urgency. This tactic works especially well in a polarized society, where people are already fearful of the other side. For example, during elections, political parties often paint their opponents as enemies of the nation, warning voters that the survival of their way of life depends on their vote. Politicians often use these hype dangers to distract from real issues, drawing attention away from things like economic inequality or failing infrastructure. By focusing the public's attention on an exaggerated or fabricated threat, they can avoid addressing more pressing concerns. The more fearful voters become, the easier it is for politicians to push their own agendas without much scrutiny. If you're enjoying this video and want to stay informed about how politics affects us all, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our future content. Chapter 4. The Politics of Panic. Using national tragedies for political gain. National tragedies often become the perfect backdrop for fear-based political strategies. Whether it's a natural disaster, terrorist attack, or economic collapse, politicians use these events to sway voters and solidify their power. The psychological effect of a crisis is profound. People are more willing to trust leaders who promise stability in chaotic times. Politicians recognize this and move quickly to frame themselves as protectors. Take the aftermath of the September 11th attacks. George W. Bush's approval ratings skyrocketed after the terrorist attacks, not because of immediate policy success but because he presented himself as the steadfast leader who would protect the nation from further harm. Fear, combined with uncertainty, created a golden opportunity for political gain. According to a study by the American Political Science Review, national crises have been shown to make voters more supportive of authoritarian policies, often in exchange for perceived safety. The same strategy was used during Hurricane Katrina in 2005. While the response was widely criticized, the disaster allowed politicians to push forward a narrative of needing stronger government intervention and control. Fear about the consequences of another such event led to increased funding for emergency preparedness, despite debates about the efficiency of such investments. In these cases, fear serves as a tool to justify policies that might not have been accepted under normal circumstances. Fear of foreign enemies, too, often gets amplified after national tragedies. When the US faced the threat of terrorism, the war on terror narrative took hold. Leaders painted a picture of an ongoing, existential threat to American values. This fear-driven rhetoric allowed for policies such as the Iraq War and the Patriot Act, decisions that might not have gained widespread support had they not been framed in the context of national security. This strategy isn't limited to disasters, though. Economic downturns have historically been used to push political agendas. During the Great Depression, Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal successfully utilized the fear of economic collapse to rally the public behind significant government intervention. Leaders understand that fear of losing economic stability can push voters to accept sweeping changes they may otherwise resist. When a crisis strikes, it often shifts the public's focus toward immediate solutions. Politicians can capitalize on this urgency to push policies that may be controversial but deemed necessary for the greater good. It's this ability to shape how a tragedy is perceived that gives politicians a huge advantage in controlling voter sentiment. Chapter 5. Fear in Campaign Ads. The subtle persuasion in modern politics. Fear is often embedded in campaign ads, sometimes so subtly that we don't even notice it. These ads rely heavily on visual and emotional cues to stir up anxiety and create a sense of urgency. Through dramatic imagery and music, ads can evoke a gut response from voters, making them feel like a vote for the other candidate is a vote for disaster. Take the infamous Daisy ad from the 1964 presidential campaign. The ad featured a little girl picking petals from a flower, followed by a countdown to a nuclear explosion. The message was simple yet chilling: voting for Barry Goldwater would lead to nuclear war. The ad didn't directly say anything about Goldwater's policies, but it effectively used the fear of a nuclear attack to sway voters to Lyndon B. Johnson's side. This method works because of the power of association. When voters see images of destruction, war, or violence, they instinctively associate those visuals with fear, even if they have no real understanding of the political issue at hand. According to a study by the National Bureau of Economic Research, negative ads, especially those using fear, are 20% more likely to influence voters' opinions than positive ads. The emotional response generated by fear tends to override logic, making it a potent tool for persuasion. Additionally, these ads often feature stark contrasts between the candidate's message and the fear-driven narrative. A candidate may present themselves as the only person capable of saving the country from this looming danger, positioning their opponent as weak or naive. This, us versus them, strategy can polarize voters and create loyalty through fear of the alternative. Modern political campaigns often use sophisticated data analytics to target voters most susceptible to fear. By analyzing social media activity, browsing habits, and even psychological profiles, campaigns can tailor fear-based messages to resonate with individuals on a deeply personal level. This personalization of fear-based campaigning is one of the most advanced tactics in the modern political playbook. Fear in campaign ads isn't just about creating dread, it's also about ensuring voters feel empowered to act. When fear is combined with urgency, voters feel compelled to make decisions quickly, often without fully understanding the long-term consequences. In this way, politicians shape the narrative and push voters toward a decision driven by instinct rather than careful thought. Chapter 6: Fighting Fear with Facts. How to escape the cycle of manipulation. While fear has been a powerful tool in politics, there are ways to break free from its grip. The first step is education. By understanding how fear is used to manipulate, voters can become more critical of the messages they hear. Instead of reacting instinctively, we can make decisions based on facts and reason. Critical thinking is one of the best defenses against fear-based politics. When politicians try to invoke fear, it's essential to pause and question the source of that fear. Is the danger real, or is it exaggerated? Is the politician offering a genuine solution, or are they simply trying to exploit our emotions? By asking these questions, voters can begin to see through the manipulation. One technique for combating fear-based politics is to focus on long-term outcomes. Fear-driven decisions often focus on immediate results, like stopping terrorism or securing borders, without considering the broader consequences. By focusing on the facts, voters can begin to evaluate policies based on their true impact, not just the fear they evoke in the moment. Social media plays a major role in the spread of fear, but it also provides an opportunity to combat it. Fact-checking websites and independent news sources allow voters to access accurate information. Tools like Snopes and PolitiFact help debunk false claims and reveal when fear is being used to manipulate the public. The key is not to take everything at face value, especially when it comes to emotionally charged messages. Lastly, unity is a powerful antidote to fear. Politicians often use fear to divide the public, making us distrust the other. But when people come together, across political lines, they can resist fear-based manipulation. As history has shown, citizens united in purpose and values are less likely to be swayed by fear-driven narratives. By building awareness, promoting critical thinking, and fostering unity, we can push back against fear-based politics. In the end, it's our ability to resist fear and seek truth that will lead to more informed and empowered voters.